Hi, so for this week, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the main themes and takeaways that I had from the modules to answer some of the following questions, and the way that my thoughts were sort of grouped together throughout reading the text, listening to the podcasts, and engaging in the online lectures were who we are and the context in which we are embedded. So that was sort of the mantra per se this week that led my thinking and dictated the emotions I felt, what I felt curious about, and what I was most surprised about. So, and I do have a script of sorts just to sort of guide my ideas and group together who we are and the context in which we are embedded to discuss the past 2 weeks' modules. So some of the emotions that I felt while engaging and learning more from the content was primarily excitement, and that was because one of the articles that we were left to read was The Art of Thinking Well by David Brooks, and David Brooks is probably my favorite op-ed writer for the New York Times. I read him just about every week or when he puts out a new article, so that was a feeling of pure excitement to read The Art of Thinking Well. And some of the takeaways that I felt very integrated with were people don't always behave rationally, but we investigate the ways in which we are systemically irrational. So he argued that a lot of times when learning new content or engaging in new ideas, we are more apt for bonding instead of truth-seeking with these ideas. And the reward of that is the pleasure of sharing an attitude that is socially approved. I think the contextualization of that idea is extremely prevalent in today's election, and the notion of what I learned in psychology of the in-group thinking, what the group thinks is socially acceptable, and how we can, maybe performatively act or virtue signal with those around us to engage in similar ideas, whether or not they be our own. Some of the truths and confirming ideas from that article included the thought that, we substitute emotions for thoughts. We, of course, are more guided by our emotions and what makes us feel rather than what stimulates us intellectually. So thinking in those processes emerge from our emotional life and our moral character. And discussing more about our moral character was a interesting confirming idea for me, because then it started to get me thinking about intellectual honesty. How can I guide the way that I lead others and the way that I integrate what I learn into my decision making to be a better leader? So the theme of intellectual honesty was very interesting for me, because I thought about when I was reading it, do I portray myself as someone who is more of a relationship-oriented leader or a task-oriented leader? I discussed this in my last reflection from, I believe it was Module 4, when I read about that in the textbook, which was a very interesting idea. And I think that connecting some of those modules that we've engaged with in the past with the theme of intellectual honesty in this module is entirely significant and an impactful surprise, because the implications for the leadership of how I, carry myself is very much guided in intellectual honesty, in being task-oriented and making sure that the thoughts and goals that I have for my followers or whoever is following me or whoever I'm underneath in any sort of leadership model or structure of sorts is very reliant on honesty and those confirming ideas that, what I say to my followers is not my moral or opinionated or biased beliefs, but my intellectual beliefs based on what I've learned, what I've read, and what I've engaged with, and kind of balance those biases. So furthermore, some of the implications for leadership that I read about in the textbook regarding to the social change model kind of got me thinking about the individual-led development level, the group-led development level, and the community-led development level. And learning about that was very applicable to your conversation with, I believe it was Lauren Oliver, and her discussion with how she grappled with her whiteness at an all-Christian college, and kind of understanding how her social identity played a role in her own self-discovery. So kind of what I discovered about myself after listening to that podcast was another confirming idea of how I want to define and solidify my own allyship in my community. I think one of the best ways that I can exemplify those thoughts and relate to Miss Oliver is through the research that I'm doing this semester with one of my past sociology professors, a PhD student, and another sociology department chair. And what we're doing this semester is we're conducting research on whiteness, white identity, and allyship, and how college students at Virginia Tech can be better allies in our communities, and especially in regards to the performative activism of the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer. Is allyship genuine? How can we reevaluate and investigate our own social identities to make sure that we are being genuine and true allies to others that are oppressed? I think that it's very important for me, and as Miss Oliver acknowledged, to recognize our own privileges. I mean, I'm a white woman who has grown up in a pretty affluent community, and recognizing that privilege and doing research on that has allowed me to be a better ally to those in my community, especially at the individual-led development model of the social change model. Furthermore, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I learned, again, from the textbook with civic engagement, specifically pertaining to direct service, community research, and advocacy and education. And I think going back to the mantra of the week, which was who we are and the context in which we are embedded, is entirely reliant on inclusivity and diversity in the environments that we are in. So the research on workplace diversity that was mentioned in some of the PowerPoint slides correlated with, economically profitable companies, that are capacity building, that have political involvement, that have positive reviews from their employees. So an inclusion framework that is so not dependent, but sees the importance of uniqueness and belongingness of their employees and peers is one that I think is of high value. And the ideas that I drew from there were able to help me apply my knowledge to the future in that, especially, what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks, and that's this election. Focusing on how I can be a better leader to facilitate a workplace or a classroom or even a roommate situation where diversity and inclusion is at the forefront of our discussions and at the forefront of how we want to engage in direct service and community outreach is incredibly important to me. And I think that I do have friends who are maybe who are politically apathetic or don't believe as much in the political process. So I think it's my job as a engaged and a political activist type of leader to educate them and continue to have those tough conversations about how we reevaluate our social identities and how we can be better allies. And to conclude, I think one of the things I was most curious about in this model were how consciousness of self and congruence were connected. I was a little bit confused about what congruence in leadership meant and the implications of that at the beginning of this. And what I learned was it's how we look at who we are and the context in which we're embedded. Applying that to myself, I am a senior woman at Virginia Tech who benefits from white privilege, but is working in my community to try and challenge that. And so our daily decisions and how we navigate our lives based off of who we are and the context we are embedded in help us to challenge ourselves better as leaders and develop those leadership skills, whether they be that convergence of consciousness of self and congruence, or focusing on inclusion and diversity, or even purely the decision to vote in the election. So I felt very excited learning a bit more about how I can redefine my own leadership skills from this module, especially reading about David Brooks, hearing more from Miss Lauren Oliver, going through the PowerPoint slides and reading from the textbook. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thanks, Professor.